Here's something nobody in the White House wants you to know. On the same morning that Donald Trump stood before cameras and told the world that Iran was ready to deal, that the right people were talking and progress was being made, Iranian military officials were on state television telling the world the exact opposite. They weren't whispering it in back channels, they weren't hinting through intermediaries. They went live and said it out loud for every government on the planet to hear. Iran has no interest in Trump's proposal. Iran does not consider what Washington sent a peace plan. And the country that was supposed to crumble under 25 days of relentless airstrikes? That country just published 5 non-negotiable conditions of its own. And every single one of them is designed to put the United States of America on the back foot. On Wednesday, March 25th, something remarkable happened through one of the most unlikely diplomatic pipelines in modern history. Pakistan's army chief personally carried a 15-point ceasefire proposal from Donald Trump to Tehran. Not an envoy, not a State Department attaché. The army chief himself, using his personal relationships with both the Trump White House and the Iranian government, physically facilitated the handover of Washington's terms for ending this war. Let that sink in for a moment. The world's most powerful military, currently running the largest air campaign since the Gulf War, had to go through Pakistan to send a letter. Now, the contents of that 15-point plan read like terms you present to a country that has already waved a white flag. Dismantle your nuclear facilities. Surrender your enriched uranium stockpiles. Cap your ballistic missile program. Sever all ties with Hamas, Hezbollah, and every armed group in your network. Reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Halt all strikes on energy infrastructure in the region. In exchange, Washington offered sanctions relief. That was the deal. Here's the problem. That proposal was sent to a country that has been absorbing American and Israeli airstrikes for 25 consecutive days. A country that, by its own official accounting, has buried over 1,400 of its people and counted more than 18,500 wounded. A country that lost its supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, in a targeted assassination on February 28th, killed while indirect nuclear talks were reportedly still active. And in all of those 25 days, through every strike and every funeral, Iran has not stopped firing back for a single hour. You don't send terms like that to a country that's fighting. You send them to a country that's already surrendered, and Tehran knew exactly what it was looking at. What Iran sent back is where this entire story changes direction. Tehran didn't just reject Trump's plan. Iran released 5 conditions of its own, publicly, on state media, for the entire world to see, and every single one of them flips the dynamic of this conflict on its head. The first condition, a full and complete halt to all American and Israeli military attacks, including what Iran specifically called targeted killings. That phrase is a direct reference to the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei on February 28th. Iran is demanding that the method that started this war be formally declared off the table before any conversation about ending it begins. The second condition, enforceable, verifiable guarantees that this war will never be repeated. Iran isn't asking for a ceasefire. It's asking for a permanent legal architecture that prevents Washington from using diplomacy as a cover story for planning another military campaign. Tehran pointed directly at 2 rounds of nuclear talks in 2025, which Iran now claims were used as intelligence-gathering cover for preparing the exact campaign that launched on February 28th. If those talks were real negotiations, Iran says, this war would never have happened. The third condition, full reparations for war damages, not a contribution to reconstruction, not an aid package dressed up with diplomatic language. Reparations. Formal acknowledgement that the United States caused this destruction and owes Iran compensation for it. That is the kind of demand you make when you believe you are winning. The fourth condition, a comprehensive end to fighting on every front. Not just the US-Iran theater. Iran is demanding a simultaneous halt to hostilities in Lebanon, in Iraq, and across every armed group aligned with Tehran in the region. This is Iran telling Washington that the war it started cannot be ended piecemeal. You end all of it, or you end none of it. And then there is the fifth condition. The one that changes everything. The one that should have every energy analyst, every defense official, every economic strategist in the world stopping mid-sentence. Iran is demanding international recognition of its authority over access through the Strait of Hormuz. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated it directly on Iranian state media. Iran does not want a ceasefire. Iran wants the war to end permanently, on Iranian terms, with full compensation for the destruction and with the world formally acknowledging that the most important waterway in global energy trade belongs under Iranian control. That is not a negotiating opening bid. That is a closing statement. Lieutenant Colonel Ibrahim Zulfagari went on Iranian state television and addressed the United States directly. He asked whether America's internal confusion had reached the point where it was negotiating with itself. He said that a country claiming to be a global superpower would have already found a way out of this disaster if it actually had the ability to do so. He told Washington not to disguise its military defeats as diplomatic agreements, and then he said something that should have ended any illusion of progress. The era of empty American promises is over. That is not a man reading carefully calibrated diplomatic language. That is a military official publicly and deliberately slamming the door shut. on camera, on the record, for every government watching. And here is where the gap between Washington's narrative and Tehran's reality becomes impossible to ignore. Iran's foreign minister confirmed on the record that no negotiations had taken place with the United States. Not direct talks, not indirect talks, not even proximity negotiations where both sides sit in separate rooms in the same building. He stated clearly that passing messages through intermediaries does not qualify as negotiation. Meanwhile, a U.S. official told Axios that Washington had not yet even received a formal rejection of the 15-point plan. Think about what that means. Iran was broadcasting its refusal in real time on live state television to an international audience, and the White House hadn't gotten the message yet. The machinery of American intelligence and diplomacy, the most well-funded national security apparatus in human history, was behind on news that anyone with a television could watch in Tehran. Trump, for his part, told reporters in the Oval Office that Iran had given him a very big present worth a tremendous amount of money related to oil and the Strait of Hormuz, and that he was dealing with the right people. He did not specify what the present was. He did not explain what talks he was referencing. Iran had not confirmed any talks were happening. The contradiction between what the President of the United States was saying and what was actually occurring on the ground had never been more stark. News published an exclusive on March 25th based on reporting from 3 current U.S. officials and 1 former official. Every day since the start of the Iran war, military staff have been compiling a video for the president. The video runs approximately 2 minutes. It shows the biggest, most visually impressive American strikes on Iranian targets from the previous 48 hours. One U.S. official described its content as a montage of things blowing up. That is a direct quote. 2 of those officials told NBC that the format raises serious concerns among people close to Trump, that he is not receiving a full and accurate picture of this war. The video emphasizes American successes. It provides minimal detail on Iranian counteractions. It does not show the full scope of what is happening on the ground from the other side. Now connect that to what Trump has actually said publicly. He claimed that Iran's air defenses, its navy, and its radar systems had all been completely destroyed. He told reporters that nobody was shooting at American forces. He said this after a U.S. F-35 made an emergency landing following a combat mission over Iran, while reports that it had been hit by Iranian fire remained unconfirmed and under investigation. The official account and the battlefield reality were not the same story. A commander-in-chief who receives a 2-minute highlight reel of explosions, who believes the enemy's military has been destroyed, who publicly claims nobody is shooting at American aircraft, while an F-35 is making an emergency landing, is operating with a fundamentally distorted map of this war. And the decisions being made from that distorted map are moving tens of thousands of troops, hundreds of billions of dollars of military hardware, and the entire structure of global energy markets. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Every single day before this war began, roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passed through it. Iran declared the strait closed on March 2nd, 4 days after the war started. Since then, Reuters has reported that tanker traffic through Hormuz dropped approximately 95% from pre-war levels, with large numbers of vessels anchored in or outside the Gulf, waiting to see what happens next. But Iran didn't just close the waterway. Reports from Lloyd's List and Bloomberg describe what some analysts are now calling the Iran toll booth. According to Lloyd's List reporting, certain vessels have been granted passage through an Iran-approved corridor in exchange for large fees. One reported fee was in the range of $2 million, with more than 20 vessels reportedly having used the route. The full scale of the system, whether it is formalized, and what currencies are being demanded remain less firmly established. But the framework is real. Iran has converted the most important shipping lane on Earth into a revenue-generating choke point under its direct authority. The economic consequences are already cascading through every corner of the global economy. Reuters reported Brent crude peaked at approximately $119.50 per barrel in mid-March, with prices remaining more than 40% above pre-war levels. At U.S. gas stations, the average price of regular gasoline reached roughly $3.88 per gallon by mid-March. Diesel crossed $5. Gulf producers, Iraq, Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, collectively cut output by at least 10 million barrels per day. The International Energy Agency released 400 million barrels from global emergency reserves and formally declared this the greatest energy and food security disruption since the 1970s. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on certain long-term LNG contracts. The damage is not theoretical, it is already here, already priced in, already felt at the pump and in grocery store receipts. And Iran's fifth condition, the demand for international recognition of authority over the strait, isn't just a diplomatic trophy. It is the legal architecture Iran needs to make this arrangement permanent. If the world acknowledges Iran's right to control Hormuz, the toll booth doesn't end when the shooting stops. It operates indefinitely, generating revenue, projecting power, and giving Tehran leverage over the global economy that no sanctions regime can easily reverse. Nearly half of the world's processed sulfur passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Sulfur prices have roughly doubled since the strait's closure. That might sound like a footnote to an energy story, but it isn't. Sulfur is a critical input in the extraction of cobalt and copper. Without sulfur, the mining and refining of those metals slows to a crawl. And cobalt and copper are the materials embedded inside every missile guidance system, every fighter jet circuit board, every radar array, and every precision drone that the United States military depends on to function. A substantial share of global helium, which is essential for semiconductor fabrication, also originates in Gulf region production facilities. Semiconductors are inside every advanced weapon system that modern warfare runs on. The closure of Hormuz is not just shutting off oil, it is degrading the industrial supply chain that allows the US to manufacture and replenish the weapons it is using in this war right now. The numbers here are staggering. The opening 36 hours of Operation Epic Fury alone consumed over 3,000 guided weapons and interceptors. The Pentagon estimated that those first 2 days cost $5.6 billion in munitions. The war is burning through approximately $200 million per day. Replenishing those weapons requires rare earth elements. The United States reportedly has only 2 months of rare earth reserves remaining. And here's the part that makes this a strategic trap rather than just a supply problem. China controls the mining, refining, and processing of rare earth materials globally. Beijing dominates this supply chain. The Hormuz closure has simultaneously cut off the sulfur routes needed to extract replacement minerals, and Washington is currently in the middle of a full-scale trade war with Beijing. This is the math that no 2-minute explosion reel captures. The weapon stockpile is shrinking. The ability to rebuild it is compromised. The country that controls the critical raw materials is the same country Washington is fighting economically. And House Speaker Mike Johnson has already publicly admitted that restocking munitions will face resistance in Congress, floating the idea of wrapping the funding into budget reconciliation rather than passing it as a clean defense appropriation. Even the money needed to sustain this war is politically contested. If you thought this war was contained to a US-Iran bilateral conflict, what happened on March 24th and 25 in Iraq should change your assessment entirely. U.S. airstrikes hit a military clinic and an engineering facility at the Habaniya base in Anbar province. 7 Iraqi soldiers were killed, 13 more were wounded. The base is jointly operated by the Iraqi army and the Popular Mobilization Forces, the Hashd al-Shabi, a network of Shiite militias that is formally integrated into Iraq's official military structure. This was not a strike on a militia compound. This was a strike on a facility shared with regular Iraqi army personnel. Baghdad's response was immediate and unambiguous. Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani ordered the foreign ministry to summon the senior American diplomat in the country. Iraq called the strikes a fully fledged crime that violated international law, particularly because a military medical facility was targeted. Iraq announced it would file a formal complaint with the UN Security Council with documented evidence, and the Prime Minister authorized the Shiite militias to respond using all available means under the UN Charter. They didn't wait long. At Camp Victory, militia forces deployed a swarm of first-person view drones that destroyed a Black Hawk helicopter and a radar installation. The drones circled the base and found no meaningful resistance. Look at what is happening here in the context of Iran's fourth condition. Tehran demands a halt to fighting across every front, including Lebanon and Iraq. And on the very day Iran issued that demand, the war was expanding into Iraq in a way that is now drawing Baghdad itself into direct confrontation with Washington. The White House is insisting the conflict is winding down. The conflict is doing the opposite. The same week that Trump was calling this diplomacy, the Pentagon was doing something that does not look like diplomacy at all. On March 25th, the Pentagon confirmed that elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, its headquarters, division enablers, and the 1st Brigade Combat Team would be deploying to the U.S. Central Command Area of Operations in the Middle East. Approximately 1,500 paratroopers from one of the Army's most elite rapid reaction forces are heading to a theater already thick with American firepower. And the 82nd Airborne is not traveling alone. 2 Marine Expeditionary Units, totaling approximately 5,000 Marines, are arriving in the region within days. A Marine Expeditionary Unit is not a logistics or support element. Each MEU is a self-contained combined arms force, capable of amphibious assault, direct action raids, and sustained combat operations. 2 of them arriving simultaneously is not a show of force. It is an invasion-ready capability package. Pentagon analysts have reportedly discussed scenarios involving the seizure of Karg Island, the island that handles approximately 90% of Iran's oil exports. If Washington wanted to cut off Iran's economic lifeline while simultaneously ending the Hormuz blockade through force, Karg Island is the operational objective that makes that possible. There is one enormous legal problem sitting in the middle of all of this. Congress has not passed an authorization for use of military force against Iran, not one vote. The United States is currently running the largest air campaign it has conducted in decades without a single piece of congressional authorization for offensive operations. Adding a ground component to that campaign would trigger a constitutional confrontation between the executive branch and the legislative branch that could dwarf the military conflict itself. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has stated publicly that achieving regime change in Iran would require a ground component, not just airstrikes. An Israeli defense official has separately voiced concern that any American deal with Iran would lead to U.S. concessions that give Tehran breathing room to reconstitute its capabilities. Israel wants to retain the right to launch preemptive strikes under any agreement. Trump called for Iran's unconditional surrender weeks ago. Now he is postponing strikes, calling Iranian silence productive dialogue, and claiming a deal is within reach. These are not consistent positions. They are the positions of a policy that has not yet decided what it actually wants. While Washington and Tehran trade contradictions, two countries are quietly positioning themselves at the center of whatever comes next. Turkey has been applying steady, deliberate pressure behind the scenes. Ankara has been urging Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar not to join the American and Israeli war effort. Turkish President Erdogan has consistently framed this conflict as Netanyahu's war, a deliberate rhetorical choice that separates the US and Israel in the minds of Muslim-majority governments and gives those governments political cover to stay neutral. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian responded to Erdogan's stance by publicly praising Turkey's position and pledging mutual solidarity. That exchange matters. It means the two largest non-Arab Muslim powers in the region, Turkey, a NATO member, and Iran, the target of a NATO-aligned military campaign, are publicly expressing solidarity while Washington is conducting airstrikes. NATO's internal coherence during this conflict is not being openly discussed, but the implications are significant. Pakistan, for its part, has now played the role of literal courier in this war, hand-delivering Trump's 15-point proposal to Tehran. Islamabad has positioned itself as a neutral party with trust on both sides, a role that gives Pakistan extraordinary diplomatic leverage for a country that is not a direct combatant. Both Turkey and Pakistan are being discussed as potential venues for any future formal negotiations. But here is the fundamental obstacle that makes any near-term deal structurally unlikely. Iran's 5 conditions require the United States to acknowledge in some legally binding form that it caused unjustified damage and owes reparations. They require Washington to recognize Iranian sovereignty over a waterway that the U.S. Navy has patrolled and kept open for 40 years. They require a halt to the Israeli military campaign that the Trump administration has actively supported since it began. And they require a comprehensive end to a multi-front conflict in Lebanon and Iraq that Washington does not fully control. You cannot satisfy any one of those.